When we finally reached the forest, it felt like the whole world held its breath. The trees towered into the sky, their green leaves swaying gently in the breeze. Chapter 43. The world seemed to hold its breath. Another hour passed before we made it to a forest. Because of what happened with Cade, Raven made sure to take things extra carefully. This meant pausing every 30 seconds. I didn't complain. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. In all honesty, we were lucky it was Cade and his brother that wandered in on us. Had it been werewolves, we'd have been screwed. Knocking them out was fairly easy. Titus was already unconscious, and Cade didn't put up a fight. He knew when HED lost. We ended up leaving them inside the small dumpster, and Raven did most of the work in putting them there. It was actually her idea in the first place. She was concerned with their safety, but it would have looked suspicious for 2 humans to be knocked out in an alleyway. Raven inched closer to me as we scanned the entrance of the forest. The trees were skinny and tall, the green leaves vibrant despite the ending of summer. A small breeze swayed them lightly against each other, as they were placed close enough together to almost be touching. There was, however, a small gap in the trees. That was where both of our gazes were trained. It was as if we were magically expecting Will to waltz out of the forest, completely unharmed, and still human, judging by our luck so far. That wouldn't have foreign of an ocean, but we both knew it wouldn't happen. Another echo of screams only solidified this knowledge, pushing me forward to act. Come on. I pulled against Raven's arm, lightly. Do you still know where they are? She nodded, but pulled out of my grip, keeping both of us planted firmly in our hiding spot. We were in yet another back alley, this one much like the last. Brick walls lined the buildings, and the concrete beneath our feet was old and stained. I don't like this, she murmured, almost too softly for me to hear. My eyes darted between her and the trees as I bit my lip. Why, what do you hear? Nothing. Nothing new. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I listened again for Will's cries. They were less frequent now, but there was no promise they'd ever stop. Then what's wrong? She hesitated. I don't know. This was too easy, so. You've mentioned. Raven scowled. Am I wrong? It was my turn to hesitate. I couldn't answer her. We both knew she was right. But if I admitted it, then we'd be further away from getting to Will. We'll be fine. I've got a gun. Remember, I waved it at her face for good measure. It was awkward in my hands, but I tried not to let it show. Neither of us really knew how to work the thing, but I'd watched Margaret pull the trigger a few times, and figured I could manage. Do you even know how to use it? Raven's voice rose an octave. It's easy enough. You just pull the trigger. This is a bad idea, she groaned, bringing her fingers to massage her temples. I just have a bad feeling. We should really think about this. Something could be wrong. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Something's wrong. My brother is dying. Her lips pressed firmly together once more and she shot me a glare. When she didn't speak again, we both turned our gazes back to the forest to watch for movement. I don't know what I was expecting to see, or why we were still waiting. Perhaps I thought Cade would follow us. Maybe another wolf would be guarding the forest. Maybe Raven was right. Let's go, I told her, standing up before I lost my nerve. I hadn't heard Wood in a while, and I was beginning to grow anxious. Raven hesitantly followed my actions, and this time, I was the one to lead us forward. At this point, there was only one direction to go. We entered the line of trees, and I was immediately thrown back to the day I left town. Flashes of painful memories threatened to flood my senses, but I pushed them away. They would do me no good. All the images reminded me of was the fact that it failed once, and it was very likely it would happen again. But this time, It wasn't only my life at stake. I wasn't running through the forest to escape town or a person. I was heading into danger because Will was already there. The light around us quickly faded the further we walked into the forest. Trees grew thicker, foliage hung over our shoulders, and every uprooted tree limb threatened to send me flying to the ground. I walked with high knees, no matter how painful it was, in order to make it around the brush. Agent extraordinaire, *Love. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. However, acted like this was her second home. Agent extraordinaire, *Love. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It probably was. Sometime into our journey, she had resumed the position in front again. Her head was constantly tilted to the side, and wherever it tilted, that was the direction we would walk. Eventually, I started to hear glimpses of what she did. The sounds of Will's screams of agony were no longer solitary. Each cry was accompanied by loud voices, 2 of them, that I immediately recognized. I couldn't make out the words, nor did I care to. Their tone spoke enough. They were rough, demanding, and wary. When I was on the verge of making out the words the familiar voices spoke, Raven suddenly stilled. She crouched low to the ground, putting my elbow to bring me down with her. I complied immediately, cautiously scanning the surrounding trees for movement. My nerves were on edge, but it seemed I only knew this from the erratic beating of my heart. I couldn't pay attention to myself at the moment, for fear I would miss something around me. Raven turned to me, bringing her lips to whisper in my ear. Even then, I could barely hear her words. If we go any closer, they'll know we're here. I nodded, turning my gaze back to the direction the voices were coming from. They were stagnant, not moving further into the forest. The agonizing screams of Will's misery had died down momentarily. As well, we were both silent for a moment longer as we listened for anything to tell us to stop. Any sign of danger to warn us away from what we were about to do. Then again, even if there was one, I wouldn't have listened. When the silence continued, I stood. It was slow and careful and went against everything my mind wanted to do. I wanted to run, screaming, to the spot I knew Will would be. I didn't care about Riley, or even Samuel in the moment. I needed to see Will. I needed to help him. But the minuscule rational part of my brain reminded me I needed to be careful, even if this was my brother. So in the end, I listened to my body. My feet padded softly against the fallen leaves. I made no sound as I walked across the damp, dead, agent extraordinaire, *Love. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Agent extraordinaire, *Love. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Behind me, did the same. My gaze constantly searched the trees, the opening between trunks, the ground beneath me. At any moment, I could come upon them, and I needed to be prepared. The moments dragged on slowly, when I was sure time had stopped, and I wasn't even moving anymore. The trees parted just enough to allow me to glimpse carefully around an overgrown bush and into a clearing. The moon shone directly above it, brightly illuminating everything it could. Directly in the middle of the clearing, the moon flashing a relentless glare across his back, was my brother. He was broken, literally broken. Every limb was displaced and bent the opposite direction it belonged. His face was buried in the ground, and I could see the bones of his spine protruding from his back. It was arched at a terrible angle, reminding me more of a bell than a body. It was then I noticed the hand upon his back. I recognized the hand. It was the same one that held mine, that comforted me so many times before, even when I didn't want it. And it seemed in this moment, my brother held those same feelings for Samuel, or was alternating between digging at the ground beneath him and clawing at Samuel's hands on his back. With his arms breaking with any movement, it was difficult for Will to land strikes upon Samuel. Each time Will got a hold of Samuel, a large gash would appear on this flesh, and Samuel would jump back momentarily. When he'd jump back, he'd come to stand next to Riley. Samuel was never by his side for long, and the minute Will stopped lashing out at him, he'd go back to his side. Riley stayed still. He was barely a foot away from the other two, and he was clearly on edge. His body was tensed, his eyes were glowing, and his gaze never left my brother. His thick arms folded tightly around his body, and each time Will would thrash at Samuel, he'd flinch forward. But ultimately he never moved. He stayed in his position, watching the scene unfold with an unforgiving scowl. I took one more step forward and looked back to Samuel, who was kneeling beside Will. Again, his face was hard as stone, laced with concentration and determination. His lips moved too quick for me to read, and he was so absorbed in Will, it took the snapping of a twig to bring him back to reality. My gaze flinched down to my foot. Sure enough, and as clipped as it could get, it stepped on a pile of broken branches. Raven had almost done the same, but my folly had saved her from moving forward. When I looked up, not even half a second later, every set of eyes in the small clearing was pointed at me. They each held different expressions, and each screamed at me for different reasons. Once again, though my mind pushed me forward to Will, my body stayed still. It wasn't my move, it was theirs. As if in answer to my thoughts, Will suddenly screamed again. His confused gaze broke away from my face, as he buried his face in the ground once more. Terrible and heavy cracking broke forth from his legs, and it was enough to cause me to flinch backward. By the time the noise was gone, Will's legs looked broken in the middle, almost as if he deformed another bone there. Will didn't move. He breathed heavily on the ground, groaning loudly into the dirt. The minute he stopped moving, Samuel stood abruptly and stared me down. He didn't wait for me to speak. To my agent extraordinaire, _Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He balled his fist at his side and stalked towards me. I was tempted to cower, but my body held firm, even if Samuel didn't want me here. And I wasn't leaving. What are you doing here? Samuel came to stand before me. His face was shadowed from an expression, but I didn't have to look into his eyes to know what they held. His voice told me everything. He spoke to me through his teeth with clipped words sharp enough to cut my aid of bravery. Samuel, Riley suddenly called out. There wasn't a hint of sarcasm or humor anywhere near his voice. When I looked around Samuel's frame, I could see that Riley had moved from his stiff position to kneel at Will's side. However, Samuel ignored the both of them and forced my gaze back to his own. In here for my brother. As if on cue, another round of screams and breaking bones ensued. My eyes darted around Samuel and I got another glimpse of Riley kneeling at Will's side before Samuel harshly gripped my shoulders. I told you to stay home. You have to leave. This is dangerous. Samantha. He looked past me for a moment, eyeing Raven behind me. His voice dark and even more. And you. I specifically told you to keep her safe. You shouldn't have been able to even leave the apartment. Damn it. By the time he finished, his voice was much louder than a snarl. He screamed his last word, and this time, I cowered and held back my flinch. I was still gripped tightly in Samuel's arms, and he didn't seem intent on letting me go. In not leaving, I ground out. I tried to sound determined as I pulled harshly against Samuel's grip. Let me see, Will. I can help him. Samuel bowed his head, but I knew it was out of submission. The muscles in his neck tensed even further, and he seemed to be holding himself back. His hands tightened on my shoulders. What is this? Samuel suddenly asked, one of his hands slipping down to grip my wrist. He lifted it, revealing my hand that held the gun. I gripped it tighter, and Samuel didn't fail to notice. However, instead of ripping it from my hands, he forced a sigh and dropped his hands from my wrist. To agent extraordinaire, _Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Take her home, Samuel, Riley shouted this time, his voice demanding attention. Samuel flinched, his gaze back to him for a moment. Get over here. Samuel tensed again and raised his head. He stared at me for a long and hard minute before dropping his hand from my shoulder and looking pointedly at Raven. She immediately obeyed his unspoken order and shuffled forward. Stop. I have turned to her, keeping my glare on Samuel. I'm going to help him. Let me help him. Samuel clenched his jaw, matching my glare. He didn't say anything though, and when I felt Raven's hand grip my elbow, I snapped. My hand flew behind me, immediately connecting with Raven. It was the hand holding the gun, and when the metal hit her flesh, she cried out in pain. I didn't turn around to see where to hit because, enthusiasm, in that moment, Raven released me and Samuel growled. I didn't waste time in dodging around him, flying towards my brother as quickly as possible. Samuel was on my heels in an instant, but before he could grab me, I was on my knees next to Will. I was there for half a second. The moment I landed at Will's side, something changed. His back arched further than before, and the broken limbs seemed to solidify. Vaguely, I registered Riley shouting as Will raised his face off the ground and looked at me. For a moment, his eyes held everything I remembered about my brother, but this time, a silent plea lingered there too. Then, his eyes abruptly turned a bright ruby color. A mangled noise escaped his lips. It was a sound caught somewhere between animal and somewhere between a storm. The limbs that seemed so feeble and broken just moments before tightened and tensed. I stole a glance at Will's face again, but what I saw wasn't my brother. It was a shadow of a human, a soul being taken over not only outwardly, but inside as well. He lunged. The world seemed to move in slow motion. 1 minute, I was staring at the broken soul of my brother. The next, a feral half-human was bearing down on me, teeth elongating the closer he came. I scrambled to lift myself off the ground, but it was too late. By the time I got a hold of the dirt, Will was inches from my body. My eyes closed of their own accord, and I waited for the impact. I heard the thudding of 2 bodies colliding. Pain shot up my leg. Feral, wild, and vicious snarls echoed in my ears. But teeth never sank into my flesh. I waited and waited for the impact, but it never came. I felt a heavy weight settle on my chest. It refused to move, and after a moment, I forced my eyes open. Riley was laying across my chest. His back was to me, and in the distance, I saw Will curled into a ball next to a tree. He was breathing heavily, panting, sobbing. Immediately, I pushed against Riley, but again, he wouldn't let move. Samuel was there in the next moment. I watched him sprint to my side and push Riley's heavy weight off my chest. Riley groaned at the movement but made no action to move. He rolled off my shoulders and fell to the grass. He fell on his back next to me, and when my gaze landed on him, I realized why he was moving. There was a large chunk of his chest missing. Blood was quickly oozing out of the wound, staining what remained of the shirt he'd been wearing. My world seemed to still for a moment as I watched his chest rise and fall erratically. The rest of his body was completely still, as if moving any other limb would send him over the edge. His eyes were wide open though, and after a moment, he parted his mouth. Unspoken words lingered on his lips, and he desperately scanned his vision, looking for someone to tell them to. Samuel never stilled. He didn't waste a moment. The minute Riley was off me, Samuel had taken off his own shirt and was ripping it to pieces. He wrapped the material tightly around Riley's wound, his knuckles turning white with the effort. The entire time he worked, he didn't take his eyes off Will, who stayed cowering in the brush. Riley, however, was using the last of his strength to feebly try to catch Samuel's wrist. It seemed as if Samuel was the one those unspoken words were meant for, and Riley was determined to speak them. Even if he knew this, Samuel tried to ignore Riley. Ultimately though, Riley caught his gaze, and both of them stilled. Now that he had our full attention, Riley let out a short breath. He trained his gaze on Samuel, moving his mouth quickly, though his speech was cracked and barely a whisper. His voice was just enough to deliver the words he seemed so desperate to speak. It was the same sentence, over and over again, repeated until Riley was sure one of us caught it. "You can't lose her." The words eventually died off as nothing more than a whisper of Riley's voice. He leaned his head back, seemingly content, and closed his eyes. His body stilled, though his chest was still rising and falling. Every now and again a shudder would run across his limbs, and when it did, it only caused his rapid breathing to increase. Samuel didn't stop. When Riley finally laid back, Samuel pushed himself to find every gash, every torn piece of flesh, and knit it together with his shirt. Riley was still for the entire endeavor, and the longer this took, the more frantically Samuel worked. "Tu es agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Samuel suddenly shouted. She appeared almost immediately. He was about to shout another demand of her, but the minute he opened his mouth, both of their heads snapped to the line of trees behind Will. The world seemed to hold its breath as the two of them suddenly ducked low to the ground. Gunshots rang out. They seemed to come from every direction, and it was almost possible to see the bullets cutting through the air. I fell to my back, covering my face and ears with my hands, and buried my body as low as it could go into the brush. As the weapons continued firing, a heavy weight fell upon me. It forced the air out of my lungs and buried me deeper into the earth. It seemed to envelop my body entirely, and I felt as if I was suddenly invisible to the outside world. Large hands were placed next to my ears, on top of my own, and the stub-lie jaw of Samuel pressed against my cheek. His body was stiff, and still, across mine, gunshots still rapidly split through the air, and even Samuel's hands atop mine did little to dull the surplusting noise. In a moment of absolute madness, I slipped my hands from underneath his and placed them on his own ears. If we were going to die, I didn't want him to hear it. "Tu es agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." The shooting seemed to go on for hours. In reality, it was barely a minute. When the deafening noises finally died off, though, no one moved an inch. The silence was thick, and it seemed as if it were broken. If I stood, everyone around me would be dead. A small whimper eventually broke the silence. It came from across the clearing and was barely louder than a whisper, ever so slightly, and without moving my body, I raised my eyes off the ground to find the source. They scanned the trees before landing on my brother, who was curled into the fetal position. Blood was splattered across his naked back, and his figure shook violently. I closed my eyes, registering the ringing in my ears. I was also suddenly aware of the weight on top of me, crushing any remaining air from my lungs. It was hard to breathe, and each time I attempted, I only came up with small gasps. I did nothing to push Samuel off me, though, as the reality of what just happened was beginning to sink in. He'd throw himself on top of me, and because of that, could very well be dead. A tear escaped the side of my eye, though I hardly noticed it. Softly, hesitantly, I broke the silence. Having Samuel on top of me was torture, and I needed to know if he was alive. "Samuel," I breathed. Nothing. I realized my hands were still on his ears. I pried them away and tried again. My voice shook, and another tear slipped into my mouth. "Samuel." This time, he stirred slightly. A soft groan escaped his lips, falling on my ears. "Samantha." I choked on a sob. "Are you all right? What happened?" A moment of silence passed before he abruptly lifted his weight off me. I breathed in a large gasp of air, and Samuel surprisingly did the same. He didn't move from my body but braced himself to hover above me. As he did this, I watched his gaze move across the clearing, and eventually, I did the same. Will was still curled into a ball, but now, His trembling had turned into fits of tremors. The trees around him were broken and splintered, and dust was falling from their midst. I turned my head to the side, and my gaze landed on another figure. This one was unmoving. Blood coated them completely, and when I saw the disembodied face, cold and lifeless eyes stared back at me. Riley. I let out an involuntary gasp, and Samuel immediately hushed me. My hand plastered itself over my mouth, and I tore my gaze away from Riley. Samuel was staring at the same spot, but unlike me, he wouldn't look away. His face was hard. The only emotion leaking onto his expression was one of caution. Something stirred in the trees behind us, and Samuel immediately whipped his gaze to the noise. Growling, he tensed above me, closing the distance between my body and his own. A soft voice cut out. Beta. Tu es agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Samuel breathed, though he didn't relax. I lifted my body up, twisting my head to find Raven. She was standing behind us, peeking through the line of trees. Parts of the forest were embedded in her skin, hair, and clothes, and she looked as if she'd just been eaten by the earth. Her eyes lingered on mine for a moment before she scanned the clearing. When her gaze fell upon Riley, she flinched backward and gasped. This action seemed to wake Samuel up further, and though he kept a wary eye pointed towards Will and the tree line, he jumped almost immediately to Riley's side. His hands worked quickly. He scanned Riley's body, tilted his head, pressed fingers against his neck. After a moment, he cursed harshly and began pumping his palms against Riley's chest. Every few minutes, a chi leaned down over his face, and Riley's chest would rise with air. Then, Samuel would continue his pumping, never ceasing to try and breathe life into his best friend. It didn't work. Endless minutes of Samuel beating against Riley's chest, cursing at him, screaming for him to breathe, did nothing. He was dead, and whether it was the wounds Will inflicted on him, or the foreign gunshots piercing the rest of his body, we would never know. Chapter 40. For the night turned to glut. Samuel didn't stop. Even when it was clear Riley's body would never move again, he continued to force it to try. His movements became harsh, limbs locking with the strain he forced upon them. The longer this went on, the more brutal his actions became, and it was clear to me he was going to slow down. There should have been some ounce of exhaustion in his body, some inkling of tiredness, but the only evidence Samuel had been overworking himself was the sweat pooling around his hair. He paid no mind to it, just as he ignored the blood leaking out of his back. Pieces of his skin were missing, and bullets stuck out from the fresh wounds. The blood from these injuries seemed to paint a picture of death on his back, and that only added to his crazed demeanor as he continuously beat against Riley's chest. Samuel's body refused to fail him, but his face was another story. It was slowly crumbling. His cold and determined eyes slowly melted away, revealing a frenzied glint permanently etched into his irises. His mouth was hanging open, and short, ragged breaths forced their way out of it. The wrinkles and lines of his face grew deeper, as if every moment past was another year taken from Samuel's life. Samuel, I softly whispered, watching, horrified, as he began ferociously shaking Riley's limp body. However, Samuel didn't respond to me. He didn't even flinch. He only continued shaking Riley, cursing with every passing breath. My own breathing was ragged, and before I knew it, I was shaking too. It was only a slight tremor, but it was enough to take over my senses. I helplessly watched Samuel, completely oblivious to the world, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to curl into a ball and disappear into the trees. I ached to crawl away from this clearing, and never look back. I wanted to ignore Riley's lifeless body, to pretend my brother was the monster, curled into a bloody ball across the clearing. I wanted to ignore everything that just happened, and run as far away as my legs could take me. But I couldn't. I knew I couldn't, and that was perhaps the thing that terrified me the most. Tu es agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I spoke before my mind caught up with my mouth. Slowly, I turned to face her, wincing with the movement. I immediately pushed the pain away, knowing that if I didn't act now, I would give in to the large part of me that wanted nothing more than to disappear. Raven hesitantly stepped forward and crouched down next to me, her gaze avoiding Samuel and Riley. I watched her for a moment, trying to keep my voice even. We need to get out of here. Can you tell if anyone is still here? Her face paled, but, despite her wide eyes in clear horror, she slowly nodded. I'll check the perimeter. She stood, quickly turning away from me and heading back into the trees. I watched her body slowly disappear, acutely aware that whoever had attacked us could still be just beyond our vision, lying in wait to fire another round. My gaze fell from the trees and landed on the grass where Raven had walked away. I noticed the gun they'd clung to earlier, the one that had provided me a small ounce of protection. Now it mocked me. Despite this, I leaned forward and took it in my hands once more, ignoring the shaking of my limbs. Once in my hands, I was tempted to throw it as far away from me as possible, but I resisted the urge and took a deep breath. If we were going to be attacked again, I wasn't going down without a fight. A mangled cry resembling what used to be my brother's voice broke through my ears. I whipped my gaze to him, just in time to notice Will's body, or what was once Will's body, go still. It stopped trembling, stopped convulsing, and almost seemed to stop breathing. A shot of panic pierced my chest, and without thinking, I tried to stand and run to him. I immediately fell back to the ground, crying out in pain. It began in my ankle, traveling up my body until it stopped at my side. The burning of my old wound intensified, and I felt as if the skin was being ripped apart. My ankle felt a similar pain, but when I pulled my weight off, I fought to keep my breathing even as spots danced in my vision. My gaze stayed trained on Will, and after a moment, I saw a slight rise and fall of his chest. This eased the panic I felt only slightly. He was still motionless, and still covered in blood. Whether it was his own, or someone else's, I had no idea. Samuel suddenly let out an especially loud curse, pulling my attention back to him. When I looked up, my heart broke. Tears were cooling around his eyes, and he still hadn't stopped assaulting Riley's body. He was panicking now. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. As if it was only just dawning on him that Riley was gone, I took a deep and shaky breath, closing my eyes for a moment. My attention was being pulled every single direction, and there was still the large urge to shut everything out. But I had to focus, if I had any hope of saving Will, or living through the rest of the night. I couldn't shut down, but I also knew that I couldn't do this alone. Unfortunately, Samuel wasn't anywhere near functioning. He was still maniacally forcing Riley back to life, cursing things I didn't even know existed. Of course it had to be in this moment that I realized how much we needed him. How much I needed him. I opened my eyes and began moving, not thinking about my actions. My body inched towards Samuel, and almost out of instinct, my hand reached out to his shoulder. It hesitated in the air just above his skin, shaking in time with my breath. Samuel, I called out, closing the distance between his shoulder and my hand. I placed my palm lightly across his skin, ignoring the blood staining my fingers. At my touch, Samuel stilled. His shoulders rose and fell rapidly, but any other movement ceased. His hands were still on Riley's chest, and he was kneeling practically on top of his body. I tried to catch his eye, but Samuel kept his head bent as low as possible. The night turned to glass and silence was heavy upon the surface. It seemed if either of us spoke, it would shatter in an instant, and Samuel would break with it. I bit my lip and took a deep breath, moving to close any distance between our bodies. My hand gently squeezed his shoulder as I used it to pull me closer, and I was sharply aware of the blood that would soon be staining my body. Samuel stiffened with my movements, but he remained mute, seated permanently next to Riley. His gaze was forever on his best friend's face, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew tears would be lying in wait. Samuel was broken. I didn't have to look at him to know it. Ignoring the growing pain in my side, I sat up on my knees and placed my other hand on Samuel's other shoulder. Gently, I pulled him back. Again, he stiffened, refusing to budge from his position. If anything, he turned away the smallest amount, showing me nothing but the skin of his back. I leaned forward, trying to twist Samuel's shoulders as I did so. My lips met his ear, and I again spoke quietly. Samuel, look at me. He remained still for a moment longer, before finally giving way under my pull. He reluctantly turned his upper body to face me, keeping his gaze low on the ground. It was shielded by the moon shadows and his dark hair hanging limply across his eyes. Now that he was facing me, I dropped my feeble grip from his shoulders and found his hands in my own. I gripped them tightly, willing words into my touch. I could feel him looking at our hands, so I gave them a gentle squeeze and intertwined our fingers. Almost out of instinct, he curled his fingers into mine, pulling them lightly to his lap. Samuel, I softly tried again. When he raised his face a fraction of an inch, I forced the unpleasant words from my mouth. We have to leave. He abruptly shook his head, eyes darting back to Riley's body. I caught a glimpse of his features, and couldn't help but notice how utterly lost they were. It suddenly felt as if a massive weight had fallen on my chest, and for some reason, I felt lost too. The feeling was painful and instantly took the breath from my lungs. It was like the pain of my side. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It was an empty and ever-ending abyss. I gasped involuntarily, and at that, Samuel finally raised his gaze to meet mine. His mouth hung half open, and water pooled inside his eyes. He let out a harsh breath, and I soon knew the pain I felt was only a fraction of what lied in him. I stared into his dark eyes as tears made their way into my own. I wanted to comfort him somehow, but I couldn't find the words. There was nothing that could be spoke to alleviate the reality he was living. Our attention was abruptly taken away when something moved in the trees. Samuel tensed, leaning towards me to cover my body with his own. I reached for the gun it deposited at my side, gripping it tightly as some sort of sick comfort. Before either of us could act, though, a familiar voice met our ears. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Samuel. Peyton's brace hard in tone broke the tense silence. Samuel relaxed slightly but didn't move from in front of me. He didn't have time to respond before Peyton came into view, towing several others behind him. In their midst was Raven, cowering several paces away from the nearest person. One by one, the group filed into the clearing. Each time they did, their reaction was the same. They de-skinned their surroundings until they noticed the body next to Samuel and I. When they realized who it was, they stilled. Silence filled the air as each of their gazes fell on the Alpha's dead body. I felt the need to avert my eyes, to avoid their horrified stares, but I refrained. I took them all in, feeling a piece of my heart break for each of their disbelieving expressions. Peyton was at the head of them all, but unlike everyone else, he had his gaze trained on Samuel. We were ambushed. Samuel eventually spoke. His voice was cracked or broken, but came out strong and full. I darted my gaze back to him, only to find that his face was completely devoid of emotion. Tears were no longer brimming in his eyes, and his mouth was set in a firm line. Where the hell were you? Bray. For a moment, Peyton's eyes darted wildly between Riley and the two of us. He slowly sank to his knees, gripping the grass beneath him and bowing his head. We were following their trail. It led back to town. When we heard the gunshots, we came as quickly as possible. You weren't quick enough. Samuel practically spat. The entire forest seemed tense. After a long moment, though, Samuel sighed, and everyone breathed again. He nodded once, turning his attention to the men and women behind Peyton. Take the body to the house. A few of them immediately stepped forward, obeying Samuel without a second thought. Peyton narrowed his eyes, his gaze darting between Riley's body and me. I looked at fallen into his eyes and I couldn't tell what it was. Apart from hard and cold, Samuel abruptly stood, pulling me up with him. I tried to ignore the pain that shot up my leg, and to do so rested heavily on Samuel's arm. He noticed, but didn't say anything, only wrapping an arm around my waist to steady me. What happened? Peyton spoke, his voice low. He followed Samuel and slowly rose from his knees. I watched the men bend out of Riley's body, kicking it up with ease. Samuel watched them as well, temporarily ignoring Peyton. After a while, though, he sighed heavily. We were helping the new shifter. We were ambushed, shot at from behind the trees. He gestured stiffly to where Will was lying. Limply, I forced my gaze up to watch Peyton take in the news. His face was unreadable, something deep stirring in his eyes. When I looked into them, he broke his gaze away and followed Samuel's gesture. Did the boy survive? Samuel shifted. So far. Peyton slowly turned back to face us. The men and women with Riley's body had disappeared, but the others remained. There were more of them than I initially thought, and I realized that these people must have been the entire group Peyton had taken to hunt the humans. Every last one of them was now here with us. Enthusiasm, in the forest. In reality, there was many, but the 10 or 15 crowding the clearing suddenly made it seem much smaller. Raven still stood a few feet away with her head bowed and hands folded in front of her. Who shot at you? Peyton's voice was low. Samuel growled lowly. Who do you think? It was then I felt Peyton's gaze rest on me again. But it was my face he was staring at. It was the gun I still gripped tightly in my hand. I felt a sudden urge to cower away from him, to hide the one piece of protection I had hanging at my side. Peyton growled softly, his voice darkening. That's one of theirs. I stiffened, unconsciously pulling myself closer to Samuel. Peyton noticed this and continued on in a toxic voice. Where did you get that? Samantha. Samuel immediately tensed, quickly answering for me. Don't speak to her. Peyton narrowed his eyes, turning to face the people still in the clearing with us. He raised his voice slightly. That's one of the humans' guns she has. The ones that killed our alpha. The group collectively tensed, shifting their positions so they could more clearly get a look at me. I was tempted to cower behind Samuel, but there was no need. He quickly pushed me behind him. He was processing Bray's words before they even sunk into me. Stand down. Bray, we were just attacked. All of us. Peyton's eyes flashed brightly. Yet it's our alpha who is dead. And it's you who is harmed. He protected her. Raven interrupted, slowly stepping forward. Her face was still trained on the ground, and her voice wavered. The beta threw himself on top of her. That is why she is unharmed. All eyes turned back to Peyton, who smiled. To my agent extraordinaire, _Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I would expect nothing less, but that still leaves us with the question as to why the betas mate as one of the humans' guns, and why you are both here in the first place. He shot an angry look at Raven, who immediately stepped back. This was the duty of our Alpha and Samuel. Alone, if I remember correctly. You two were ordered to stay behind. Now is not the time. Gray, Samuel practically spit. We can answer questions later. Right now, we need to get back to town and find whoever did this. To my agent extraordinaire, _Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Beta, in just trying to guard the rest of us from the human. I didn't miss how Peyton said human and not humans. It suddenly struck me what he was implying, and I immediately gripped Samuel's arm to bring myself back into view and protest the accusation. He seemed to be anticipating this, though, and blocked my way to the others even further. Samuel stood up straighter. He responded to Peyton in what could have been the iciest voice possible. Guarding us was something that should have been done before our alpha was killed. Before Peyton could respond, he pushed on, biting his words. Go and scout the area. I want cars waiting for us at the end of the forest. He paused then, lowering his voice considerably, and he foreshortened again. It won't be the humans who need hiding. Gray. Peyton Gray stiffened, his eyes flashing with fury. The men and women behind him cowered at Samuel's tone, and quickly dispersed into the trees. Peyton hesitated for a second more before a smile spread across his face. It didn't reach his eyes, or any part of his expression, and I suddenly felt as if I was looking into the face of a murderer. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Beta. Chapter 45. The pack house. What the hell was that? I bit out as soon as Peyton disappeared into the trees. I would say Samuel stiffened again, but his body never ceased its tension. He ignored my question and called out into the trees for Raven. She immediately reappeared, eyes darting behind her and back to Samuel, who didn't miss a beat. Stay. I need help with Samantha. Raven nodded and came to my side, putting her arm around my waist as Samuel removed his. He walked to the edge of the clearing, practically stalking the entire time. When he reached Will's body, he picked him up without hesitation. Wait, I called to him, tripping over Raven as I tried to walk. He paused, and I hesitated, not sure what I was going to say before it left my lips. Don't let him hurt you. Samuel shook his head and walked back toward us, slinging Will's body across one of his shoulders. Achia's going to be out for a while. Samantha. He paused next to the two of us, glancing warily around the clearing. It was deathly quiet for a few moments as he listened intently to every piece of the forest. Eventually, do you hear anything? To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She fervently shook her head no. What did you smell when you were out there? Just our pack. Peyton and the others. Samuel's brow furrowed, bringing me back to my earlier question. I looked at Samuel, expectantly. What just happened? What's going on? He looked at me, but for once, I could tell nothing from his face. It was hard, cold, and emotional. Samuel ignored my question again, adjusted Will on his shoulders, and walked past the two of us. And going first, you to stay directly behind me. Don't leave my side for any reason. Understand? Raven instantly voiced her compliance, but I could only nod my head. My thoughts were swimming with the encounter earlier, and I wasn't given any time to sort through the currents. And the minute Raven acknowledged Samuel, he began moving. Raven darted forward, and I was forced to stumble alongside her. She held most of my weight, as any pressure I put on my ankle was enough to send me to the ground. The minutes spent getting back to the entrance of the forest were torture. None of us spoke, and the tension in the air was enough to drive me insane. Anxiety crippled what was left of my body, and with any snapping of a twig, any rustle of the trees, another wave of apprehension followed. Samuel had sent the others ahead to make sure it was safe, but that hadn't guaranteed anything. There was no promise that at any moment, shots would ring through the air again, but they never did. We ended up on the edge of the forest in hand. As Samuel has demanded, a car was waiting for us there. There was no one else around, but the car was running and ready for us to take. He didn't waste a second in leading us to it. And after he scanned the interior, he opened the back door and laid Will across the seats. He took up the entire back row, so the only place left for the three of us was the front. Samuel opened the passenger door, jutting his chin towards the opening. Raven carried me forward and the two of them helped me slide into the middle seat. The movement sent waves of pain crashing around almost every part of my body, but I refused to acknowledge them. I bit down hard on my lip and kept my breathing steady, keeping myself distracted with counting my breaths. It only took a few of them for Raven and Samuel to follow me into the car, Samuel got into the driver's seat, while Rave positioned herself between me and the door. She inched herself as close to the door as possible, eliminating any space between her and the tinted window. There were a few inches of space between me and her, but as soon as Samuel settled in, space was gone. The car was large, and 3 people weren't meant to sit up front. "Where are we going?" I voiced as soon as Samuel stepped on the gas, the car lurching forward with the movement. He half glanced at me. "To the house." I felt a sudden lump in my throat. Though I hesitated. The pack house, yes. Mixed feelings crept into my heart, and I wasn't sure what to do with them all. I'd never been to the infamous pack house, and frankly, I didn't want to. It was an area highly concentrated with countless werewolves, all of whom probably hated me for being a human. Sure, they claimed to live in peace with us, but if that were the case, they wouldn't congregate in one area of town. In the first place, "We're going in the back door," Samuel started, his voice emotional says. "There's a lockdown room for new shifters. We have to put Will there. You'll go in the room next to him." "Why? I don't want the pack focusing on him or you. Not until I get everything figured out." Images of Riley's dead body flashed through my mind. I stole a glance at Samuel, lowering my head in the process. With the images of Riley's dead body came the memories of Samuel beating hopelessly against his still heart. "I'm sorry," I told him in a small voice. "About Riley." His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "I need you to stay with Samantha." She had been quiet up to this point, but when Samuel spoke to her, she nodded almost too eagerly. "I'd be happy to." "Beta." He nodded once and took a deep breath through his nose. "Good." Now Samuel suddenly cut himself off. He turned to look at me, eyes narrowing considerably. I tried not to shrink away from his gaze, mostly because I had no idea why he was suddenly looking at me. His face was still uncharacteristically emotional, revealing nothing as to his thoughts or intentions. Samuel took another deep breath, watching me from the side of his eye. After he exhaled sharply, he spoke again. "Samantha, you're bleeding." "What?" "No, I'm not." My voice decided to rise an octave. I did a quick scan of my body, checking to make sure my limbs were all intact. Then, the burning of my sight was pushed to the forefront of my mind. I'd been ignoring it, and up until now, I had succeeded. My hands trailed up my hip and under my shirt, just enough so that I could feel the skin around my stitches. Sure enough, it was thick with blood. "Oh," I breathed, slowly turning my head to look back at Samuel, his hands tight and on the steering wheel. Once more, I watched the speedometer gradually start to rise as Samuel's foot pressed harder against the gas pedal. Change of plans. "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "You stay outside of Will's door until I find someone else to put there." "Anything you say." "Beta." "I'm fine," I protested, my gaze darting between the two of them. "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." It's probably just my stitches from when I fell. My eyes decided to linger on Samuel. "Besides, you're either one who needs a doctor." Again, he ignored me. No more words were spoken between us, but the car was nowhere near silent. The hum of the engine was loud in my ears, reminding me of the fact that Samuel was pushing the car to go faster every passing second. I didn't dare look outside of the window, knowing that if I did, I'd be resigned to accept that Samuel was going to crash the car. "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." We never crashed. In a record amount of time, we made it back into town. The car came to an abrupt halt outside a large building, what I deemed to be the infamous pack house. I couldn't tell much about the outside of the house, but the inside was buzzing. Lights were on in almost every window. On every floor, shadows ran across them as figures moved hurriedly between each room. A small door was standing open in the middle of the house, with a short stairway leading to it. No one was outside the door. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And it hung limply on its hinges, swinging with the wind. It looked as if someone had hurriedly run inside and forgot to close the door behind them. Samuel entered the car the instant it stopped moving. Raven was helping me out in the next moment, as Samuel moved to the back to sling wool over his shoulders. Before I could register the pain growing in my side, Raven was moving me forward, following Samuel. Blindly, the closer we drew to the door, the more noise met my ears. The hum of voices was evident, but loud shouting and harsh demands accompanied them. I was sure that when we stepped inside the house, a slew of chaos would greet us, but it didn't. We slipped inside the door, leaving it hanging open behind us, and dipped to a hallway immediately to our right. Though voices and shouts were louder now, we met nobody to match the voices with. The hallway we traveled was deserted. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust to the unnatural light streaming through the hallway, and by the time I was squinting, we were standing outside a lone door. You could tell from looking at it that it was heavy. The steel was pristine and looked ready to hold back an army, or keep one trapped inside. Samuel lifted the handle, grunting as he pushed forward. The door slowly swung open, but before I could tell what was inside the room, Samuel slipped inside with Will, closing the door behind him. I attempted to follow, but Raven held me back. As soon as I tried to protest, though, Samuel was back in the hallway. He nodded to Raven, who moved aside and let Samuel take me. She positioned herself next to the steel door, and I had to admit, she didn't look nearly as intimidating as the metal. Without another second's delay, Samuel whirled me away from Raven and started back down the hallway. Now that my eyes were adjusted, I could see the brown wooden flooring, completed by cream barren walls. We came back to the door we entered, but instead of slipping back into the night, Samuel turned again. We headed down another short hallway, and further we walked, the louder the voices became. The hall opened into a large room, and all at once, my senses were overloaded. The light was even brighter here than in the corridor, and there wasn't a single piece of the room left in darkness. We were standing underneath an archway that led into what looked to be a living room. People ran about the spacious room, bumping into each other, screaming profanities, and rushing to their destinations. Many of them were limping with torn clothes, and most of them had blood staining their skin. There was a fireplace covering the entire wall directly across from us. Light-colored bookshelves sat on either side, and each shelf was filled to the brim with countless colorful novels. The wall on the right was made entirely of windows, and beyond that, even more activity bloomed. Glass doors opened up to reveal a wooden patio, where all the furniture had been pushed to the side to make room for the people streaming in and out of the open doors. In front of the fireplace were countless matching couches and armchairs, each one placed in a specific location. Some faced the bookshelves, some faced the fireplace, and a few sat by themselves in lone corners. Fleece and worn-out rugs sat underneath each one, protecting the dark wooden floors. No one noticed our entrance. At least, not at first. Samuel and I stood under the large archway for several moments, taking in the scene before us. Then, he abruptly caught someone by the arm, and for the first time, eyes met our own. The unfortunate soul Samuel had caught was a middle-aged woman with graying hair. Her dark eyes were alight with frenzy, and when she realized who it was that held her bound, the panic increased. She breathed. The word was soft and barely made it out of her lips. As she spoke, her eyes darted to me, but then quickly fell back onto Samuel. Her breathing was heavy, but despite her frantic appearance, she let Samuel keep her bound. Samuel spoke lowly. "What's going on?" The woman's gaze darted around the room. "Everyone has just gotten back. You just missed the warriors coming in. They were attacked. They were ambushed, and didn't have time to get out. We just cleared out the bodies. We were taking care of the others when another group came in, telling us horrible things. They said that the alpha had died. She trailed off, breathless. Is it true? Is Alpha really all right? What happened? Where's Marshall? She hesitated. I don't know. Last I saw he was carrying Lane away. She trailed off. Again. Find him and tell him to meet me in the clinic. Samuel abruptly released the woman's arm, but she hesitated. Are you sure? That's where we brought the bodies. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Tell him to meet us in his office. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The woman nodded and was immediately gone from our sight. Samuel wasted no time in moving. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He kept to the back of the room, shielding me from view. I didn't question him, nor did I protest his actions, with the entire house on edge from attack. The last thing they needed was a foreign human in their midst. My steps faltered as Samuel's pace quickened. He never let me fall though, because when he noticed my struggles, his grip on my waist tightened. He slipped my arm around him, holding it firmly with his own. Using his other arm, he half-carried me, letting my weight bear down on his leg. We wound through hallways, climbed stairs, and passed countless doors. I soon lost track of my way, as every door, hallway, and room melded together to look much the same. Samuel didn't pause or hesitate as he traveled the house. His steps were deliberate and his pace quick. Had I been walking on my own, my legs would have failed me long ago. Eventually, we came to a stop outside a door that looked identical to everything else. Samuel wasted no time in throwing it open and carrying me inside. The room was dark at first, but Samuel flipped a switch and we were thrown into the white, unnatural light. Once more, the room was quaint, and apart from a large wooden desk and deep red armchairs, there wasn't much furniture. The back wall was lined with bookshelves, and another door stood on the wall next to it. Samuel brought me forward, and to my surprise, placed me atop the mahogany desk. He pushed aside paperwork and picture frames, clearing the entire desk for me. I tried to protest, but the minute I opened my mouth, he sent me a sharp look. My voice immediately died, and my protests were left hanging in my throat. Satisfied, Samuel turned away from me and disappeared to the other door in the room. When he came back a few minutes later, his face was even more emotional than before. He was holding a large first aid kit in one hand, and the other held a hospital pillow and blanket. Wordlessly, he placed the two on the desk next to me, before turning his back to me, folding his arms, and staring at the door. I waited in silence for a solid minute. Samuel stood motionless and tense. I tried to watch the door with him, but every time my gaze drifted to the opening, it would be brought back to stare at Samuel. More accurately, to stare at his back. He was still shirtless, and his wounds were looking no better now than they had in the clearing. Subconsciously, my hand slipped to my side as I watched the blood drip down his skin. My shirt was damp now, and I knew underneath the cloth my skin looked much like Samuel's. Does it hurt? He abruptly broke the silence. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The burning had intensified, and it was dying down like before. There was little to distract me. Now Samuel grunted. Dealt that. I folded my arms. Well, then why did you ask me? You've turned to me, then shook his head, and resumed his stare down at the door. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes because, in reality, I had no right to be annoyed. I had no idea what was going on with Samuel, nor why his actions were suddenly so terse. Back in the forest, he'd been beaten down. broken even. Now, it was just gone. I took a deep breath. Are you okay? I doubt that. I mimicked, raising my eyebrows. Samuel let out a heavy breath but didn't respond. For some reason, his lack of words stung. What are we waiting for? I tried again. What exactly is going on? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Who's Marshall? Tech doctor. Shouldn't he be helping the others? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. From what the woman said, Agia's going to help you. Samuel quickly cut me off. We have more than one doctor. Marshall is the best for you. Slowly, I nodded, and finally looked away. His sharp tone was stinging more than his silence. Tension blanketed the room, but I didn't have to suffer in it for long. After another minute or so, hurried and heavy footsteps echoed outside our room. When they stopped, the door was swung open to reveal a heavily breathing man.